The sharp, wet grass of Bosworth Field clings to the iron-shod hooves of warhorses. The air is thick with the metallic taste of blood and the desperate, ragged breath of dying men. It is the 22nd of August, 1485. On one side of this Leicestershire valley stands a king, Richard III, a man whose spine is curved but whose will is iron, fighting to keep the crown on his head. On the other stands a challenger, a Welsh exile named Henry Tudor, who has waited 14 of his 28 years in foreign courts for this single, sunlit moment. Henry is not a warrior, he is a symbol. He has never commanded an army in battle. But as the tide of the fight turns, as Richard III is thrown from his horse and surrounded, the fate of a nation hangs on the edge of a blade. When the king is cut down and the golden circlet is found beneath a hawthorn bush, it is placed not on the head of a soldier, but on the head of a fugitive. In that moment of chaotic silence, the House of Tudor is born, not in a palace, not in a cathedral, but in the mud, baptized in the blood of the last Plantagenet king. To understand how this fragile dynasty endured for over a century, surviving heresy, schism, and the desperate cry of an heirless queen, we must walk the cold corridors of their palaces and listen to the whispers of their betrayals. Chapter 1: The Usurper's Crown. The cold of the stone corridor seeped through the leather soles of Henry Tudor's boots. It was August of 1485, but inside the walls of Leicester Castle, the air felt like winter. He had slept in the clothes he wore, a habit born of a life on the run. The room was small, little more than a cell, but it was the first night in 14 years he had slept on English soil without the fear of being dragged back to a ship in chains. Outside, the town was silent. The citizens of Leicester were hiding behind bolted doors, listening to the rumble of cart wheels. Those wheels carried bodies, hundreds of them. The dead of Bosworth Field were being piled into carts, stripped of their armor and their dignity, to be buried in mass graves somewhere beyond the city walls. Henry stood by the narrow window, watching the grey dawn creep over the rooftops. He could still smell it, the smoke, the blood, the sweat of terrified horses. He was not supposed to be here. Every astrologer, every soothsayer, every learned man in the courts of France and Brittany had told him he would die on that field. He was a nobody, a Welsh pretender with a French pension and a claim so weak it had to be stitched together from his mother's ambitious dreams and his father's distant royal blood. Yet here he stood, King of England. A knock at the door. It was William Stanley, the man whose last-minute charge had turned the tide of the battle. He carried something wrapped in a piece of cloth. He placed it on the wooden table without a word and unwrapped it carefully. It was the crown, not the great, jewel-encrusted state crown of ceremony, but the smaller, personal battle crown of Richard III. It was dented. A smear of dirt, or perhaps something darker, stained the gold near the cross. Henry reached out a hand. His fingers hovered over it. He did not touch it. He was afraid, not of the crown itself, but of what it represented. It was a magnet for ambition. It was a target. Every man who had worn it for the past 30 years had met a violent end. Henry VI murdered in the Tower. Edward IV dead of a fever, his sons taken to be smothered in their beds. Richard III cut down in the mud. The crown was cursed, and now it was his. "Your Grace," Stanley murmured, using the title for the first time. It sounded foreign, wrong. Henry looked up. "My mother," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting orders he never thought he'd give. "She must be told." Lady Margaret Beaufort was the architect of this moment. She was the daughter of John Beaufort, a descendant of John of Gaunt, and she had poured her entire being into the belief that her son was destined for the throne. She had married and remarried for influence. She had plotted in the shadows. She had signed letters to him in code. She had risked everything. And now her son was King of England. But when the messenger rode to her home at Woking, the news did not bring her joy. It brought her a cold, calculating calm. The game was not over. It was just beginning. Henry's first act as king was not a grand celebration. It was a procession through London, a necessary piece of theatre to show the people their new ruler. He rode beneath a canopy of cloth of gold, his thin, pale face exposed to the crowds. The people cheered, but their cheers were cautious. They had cheered for Richard too. They would cheer for whoever paid the piper. Beside him, on a smaller horse, rode the men who had made this possible, the Stanleys, the Earl of Oxford, a handful of Welsh captains. They watched the crowd with wary eyes, their hands never far from their sword hilts. They knew the truth. Half the noble families of England were still loyal to the memory of the House of York, and somewhere, hidden away in the sanctuary of a church or across the sea in Burgundy, were the remaining heirs of that house. The princes in the Tower were dead, yes, murdered, most believed, by their uncle Richard, but there were others: Edward Plantagenet, the young Earl of Warwick, and Margaret Pole, and 100 cousins with grudges. As Henry passed the Tower of London, he looked up at its grey, windowless walls. It was not just a fortress, it was a mausoleum. It was where kings went to die. He shivered, though the August sun was warm on his shoulders. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. The usurper's crown did not rest easy. The Parliament met in November of that same year. The lords and bishops filed into the hall at Westminster, their robes rustling, their faces unreadable. They had come to ratify the new king. But Henry Tudor, the victor of Bosworth, had a problem. He could not claim the throne by conquest alone. That would make him a tyrant. He could not claim it by inheritance. His bloodline was too weak, too tainted by illegitimacy on his mother's side. So he did something clever. He did not mention his claim at all. Instead, he stood before them and let Parliament declare that the crown was his, that it had always been his, ever since the moment of Richard's usurpation. It was legal fiction, dressed up in velvet and Latin, but it worked. But the fiction could not warm the bed. Henry was 28 years old. He needed a wife, not just any wife. He needed Elizabeth of York. She was the daughter of Edward IV, the sister of the vanished princes, the niece of the man he had killed. Marrying her would unite the white rose of York with the red rose of Lancaster. It would bind the wounds of a generation of civil war. It was the perfect solution. But Henry hesitated. Elizabeth was beautiful, everyone said so. She had her father's golden hair and her mother's sharp intelligence. She was the prize of Europe, but she was also a Yorkist. And her mother, the formidable Elizabeth Woodville, was still alive, still plotting, still dangerous. Henry could not shake the image of Richard III's crown, dented and stained, sitting on that table in Leicester. If he married Elizabeth, he would be binding himself to a family that had a habit of killing its kings. He delayed, he put off the wedding. He let the rumors spread that he was considering a French bride, a Spanish bride, anyone but the Yorkist princess waiting in the wings. Elizabeth's mother watched from the shadows, her patience wearing thin. She had seen her sons taken to the Tower, never to emerge. She had seen her husband's line extinguished. She would not see her daughter cast aside. The pressure built throughout the winter. The people wanted the marriage. They wanted the wars to end. They wanted to believe that the sun was rising on a new age. And finally, in January of 1486, just 5 months after Bosworth, Henry gave in. The wedding was held at Westminster Abbey. It was a quiet affair, nothing like the grand ceremonies of old. Henry stood straight and still as Elizabeth approached, her gown white and gold, her face calm but unreadable. He took her hand. It was cold. He wondered what she was thinking. Did she see him as the man who had killed her uncle, the man who had kept her waiting in uncertainty for months? Or did she see him as her only chance at survival in a world that crushed women like insects? When the Archbishop pronounced them man and wife, Henry leaned in and kissed her cheek. It was a small, formal gesture. There was no passion, no fire, just the cold mechanics of statecraft. Elizabeth smiled, but it was the smile of a diplomat, not a bride. That night, in the privacy of their chambers, the mask slipped. Henry sat by the fire, staring into the flames, while Elizabeth sat at the dressing table, slowly brushing her long hair. The silence was thick. Finally, she spoke. "Do you fear me, husband?" Henry looked up. Her reflection in the mirror was watching him. "I fear no one," he lied. "You should," she said softly. "My mother taught me that men in power are most dangerous when they think they are safe." It was not a threat, it was a warning, and Henry heard it. He realized in that moment that his wife was not just a symbol, not just a broodmare for heirs. She was a Plantagenet, and Plantagenets did not forget. The first year of Henry's reign was a masterclass in paranoia. He trusted no one. He ate only food that had been tasted by his tasters. He changed his guards daily, so no man could grow too familiar with his face. He slept with a dagger under his pillow, and the doors to his bedchamber were locked from the inside, with only a small grille through which he could speak to his most trusted servants. But the threats were real. In the spring of 1486, just months after his wedding, a rebellion flickered to life in the north. It was led by Viscount Lovell, a loyal friend of the dead Richard III. Henry sent an army to crush it, and Lovell fled, swimming his horse across the River Trent to escape. He vanished into the mists of the fens, a ghost that would haunt Henry for years. Then came the pretender, Lambert Simnel, a boy, a child of perhaps 10 years old, with the face of an angel and the mind of a puppet. He was trotted out by Yorkist plotters in Ireland and proclaimed to be Edward Plantagenet, the young Earl of Warwick, who was actually languishing in the Tower of London. Henry did the logical thing. He paraded the real Warwick through the streets of London to show the people that the boy in Ireland was a fraud, but logic meant nothing to the Irish lords. They crowned the boy king in Dublin using a circlet taken from a statue of the Virgin Mary. It was a farce, but it was a dangerous farce. In June of 1487, an army of Irishmen and German mercenaries landed on the English coast. They marched south, burning and looting as they came. Henry rode out to meet them, his army smaller, his generals nervous. They met at a village called Stoke Field. It was in many ways a second Bosworth. The fighting was savage. The Irish, armed with their great axes, charged again and again into the English lines. For hours the battle hung in the balance, but in the end English discipline won. The Pretender's army was annihilated. The boy, Lambert Simnel, was captured. He was brought before the king, trembling, expecting the axe. Henry looked at him. He was just a child, a pawn. Executing him would make him a martyr. So Henry did something unexpected. He laughed, a dry, humorless laugh, and then he put the boy to work in the royal kitchens as a turnspit. It was a brilliant move. It showed mercy. It showed contempt for the rebellion, and it sent a message. The king was secure enough to joke, but in private, Henry's hands shook. He knew that Simnel had been just a symptom. The disease was the Yorkist claim, and as long as there were Yorkists alive, the disease would fester. He looked at his wife, Elizabeth. She had given him a son that year, a healthy boy baptized Arthur, a name dripping with legend, the name of the once and future king. Henry held the child in his arms and felt a surge of something he had not felt since Bosworth. Hope, but hope was a fragile thing. He looked at the windows of the nursery. They were barred. He looked at the guards outside the door. They were his most trusted men. It was not enough. It would never be enough. The House of Tudor had been forged in blood, and blood, Henry knew, would always call out for more. Chapter 2, The King's Great Matter. The old king died in the spring of 1509, and with him died the cold, grey paranoia that had gripped England for a quarter of a century. Henry VIII, the usurper who had become a miser, the warrior who had become a bureaucrat, lay in state at Richmond Palace, his thin face finally at peace. The courtiers who gathered to watch the funeral procession wind its way to Westminster Abbey did not weep. They shifted on their feet, their eyes darting toward the future. They were waiting for the sun to rise. And rise it did, in the form of his son. Henry VIII was 17 years old when the crown was placed on his head. He was everything his father was not. Where the old king had been pale and calculating, the young king was golden and exuberant. He stood over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a thick mane of auburn hair that caught the light like a flame. He could ride a horse to exhaustion and then dance all night. He could compose music and write poetry. He could shoot a bow with the accuracy of a seasoned archer and joust with the courage of a knight of old. The people of London lined the streets to watch his coronation procession, and they wept, not with grief, but with joy. They believed, with the fervent faith of the hopeful, that the golden age had arrived. On the day of his coronation, Henry passed beneath the shadow of the tower, where his grandmother's brothers had died, where pretenders had rotted, where the old king had hoarded his gold. But Henry did not look up at the walls. He looked at the crowd. He smiled. He waved. He was theirs and they were his. The new reign would be one of laughter, of pageantry, of life. That night at the coronation banquet in Westminster Hall, Henry sat beneath a canopy of cloth of gold, surrounded by the greatest nobles of the realm. He ate little. He was too excited, too aware of the eyes upon him. He kept glancing toward the figure seated to his left, his grandmother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, the architect of the Tudor dynasty. She was old now, frail, wrapped in widow's weeds. She had waited her entire life for this moment. Her son had been king. Now her grandson was king. She caught his eye and gave him a small, tight nod. The nod said, "Remember, you are a Tudor. You are here because we fought for you. Do not waste it." Henry turned away. He did not want to think about fighting. He wanted to think about glory. Across the hall, seated among the ladies of the court, was a woman who would shape that glory into something dark and twisted. Her name was Anne Boleyn. She was just a child then, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, the daughter of a rising diplomat. She watched the young king with wide, curious eyes, too young to understand that her destiny was tangled with his, too young to know that one day she would kneel before him in the same hall where he now feasted and beg for her life. But that was decades away. For now, the wine flowed, the music played, and Henry VIII was the most fortunate prince in Christendom. He had a beautiful wife, Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess who had been married to his older brother Arthur before Arthur's untimely death. She was quiet, devout, and loyal, a woman of principle in a world of compromise. Henry admired her. He respected her. He even loved her, in the way a young man loves the first woman who gives him stability. But love for Henry was never enough. It had to be proof. It had to be legacy, and legacy required a son. For nearly 2 decades, the marriage held. Catherine bore Henry children, or tried to. There was a stillborn daughter, a son, Henry, Duke of Cornwall, who lived for only 52 days, another stillborn son, and then in 1516 a girl who survived. They named her Mary. She was healthy, clever, and adored by both her parents. Henry dandled her on his knee and called her his greatest pearl. But in the quiet moments, when the fire burned low and the court was asleep, he stared into the flames and saw the future. A daughter, a woman. England had not been successfully ruled by a queen in centuries. The last time a woman had tried, the country had descended into civil war. He needed a son. By 1525, Catherine was 40 years old. Her childbearing years were behind her. The pregnancies had stopped. The hope had dried up. Henry looked at his wife and saw not the woman he had loved, but the obstacle to his dynasty's survival. He began to search the scriptures, the old books, the dusty tomes of Leviticus for an answer. And he found one. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an impurity. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless. Childless, they had one child, a daughter, but in the eyes of God was that a curse. Had his marriage to Catherine, his brother's widow, been an abomination from the start? Had God punished him with dead sons because he had defied the divine law? The question burrowed into his mind like a worm into an apple. He convinced himself that the answer was yes. He convinced himself that the Pope in Rome, who had granted the special dispensation allowing the marriage in the first place, had overstepped his authority. The marriage was invalid. It had always been invalid. He was living in sin. But the conscience of a king is a flexible thing. It bends to the needs of the heart, and Henry's heart had found a new home. Her name was Anne Boleyn. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense. She had dark hair and dark eyes, a long neck, and a small mole on her throat that she hid with a jeweled collar. She had spent her youth in the French court, where she had learned to dress, to dance, to debate theology with priests and flirt with ambassadors. She was sharp-tongued and quick-witted, and she refused to be just another conquest. When Henry first noticed her, she was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine. She watched him with a cool, assessing gaze that drove him mad with desire. He wrote her love letters. 17 of them survive, preserved in the Vatican Library like relics of a lost world. In one, he wrote, "I wish you to know how entirely I am yours." In another, he enclosed a buck he had killed the night before, sending it to her as a token of his devotion. He was obsessed. He was possessed. He was 50 years old, his body beginning to thicken, his leg beginning to ache from an old jousting wound, and Anne Boleyn held his future in her hands. She would not become his mistress. She told him that plainly. Her sister Mary had been his mistress, and what had it gotten her? A few jewels, a few apartments, and then dismissal when the king grew bored. Anne wanted more. She wanted the crown. She wanted to be queen, and she would give herself to no man until that crown rested on her head. Henry looked at her and saw not just a woman, but a challenge. He had never been denied anything in his life. He had been king since he was 17. The world had bent to his will. And now this girl, this daughter of a minor diplomat, was telling him no. It was intoxicating. It was infuriating. It was irresistible. The great matter had begun. For 6 years, the king's great matter consumed England. Henry sent his most trusted cardinal, Thomas Wolsey, to Rome to plead his case before the Pope. Wolsey was the son of a butcher, a man who had risen through sheer brilliance to become the most powerful churchman in England. He promised Henry that he would secure the annulment. He believed he could. He was wrong. Pope Clement VII was a prisoner, not in chains, but in circumstance. The armies of Emperor Charles V, Catherine of Aragon's nephew, had sacked Rome and held the Pope captive. Charles V was the most powerful man in Europe, and he had no intention of allowing his aunt to be humiliated. The Pope could not grant Henry's request even if he wanted to. To do so would be to invite the Emperor's wrath. Wolsey returned to England empty-handed. Henry turned on him with the fury of a wounded lion. He stripped him of his offices, seized his palaces, and ordered him to stand trial for treason. Wolsey, broken and humiliated, set out for London to face his fate. On the road, he fell ill. He stopped at Leicester Abbey, the same abbey where Richard III had been buried 45 years earlier. As he lay dying, he whispered to the abbot, "If I had served my God as diligently as I have done my king, he would not have given me over in my grey hairs." He died that night. Henry did not mourn him. The king needed new men. He found them in the shadows. Thomas Cromwell, a blacksmith's son who had spent his youth as a mercenary in Italy, a merchant in the Low Countries, a moneylender, a lawyer. He was ruthless, brilliant, and utterly without scruple. He saw the great matter not as a theological problem, but as a political opportunity. If the Pope would not grant the annulment, then England would simply stop asking. They would break with Rome entirely. They would make the king the supreme head of the Church of England, and then Henry could marry whomever he pleased. It was treason, it was heresy, it was madness, but Henry loved it. Thomas Cranmer, a Cambridge scholar with a quiet voice and a radical mind, was brought in to provide the theological cover. He argued that the king was not subject to the Pope, that the crown was supreme in all matters, spiritual and temporal. He wrote treatises, debated bishops, and slowly, carefully built the case for the royal supremacy. In 1533, Anne Boleyn realized she was pregnant. The timing was everything. Henry had to marry her before the child was born or risk the bastardy of his heir. In secret, in a small chamber overlooking the white cliffs of Dover, a priest married them. There were no flowers, no music, no cheering crowds, just a king, a woman, and the desperate hope for a son. When the news broke, Catherine of Aragon was cast aside. She was sent to remote manor houses, forbidden from seeing her daughter Mary, stripped of her title, her jewels, her dignity. She wrote letters to Henry, letters full of sorrow and love, begging him to remember the woman he had once cherished. He did not reply. He burned the letters. He moved on. On the 1st of June, 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England. She processed through the streets of London in a litter of white satin, her dark hair loose about her shoulders, a crown of gold on her head. The crowds were silent. They did not cheer. They remembered Catherine, the good queen, the faithful wife, cast aside for this dark-eyed enchantress. They threw insults, not flowers. Anne smiled, but her eyes were hard. She would win them over. She would give them a prince. And then they would love her. 3 months later, she went into labor. The palace at Greenwich held its breath. Henry waited in an adjoining chamber, packing, praying, sweating. The hours dragged on. Finally, the cry of a newborn echoed through the walls. The midwife emerged, her face pale. "It is a girl, Your Grace." Henry stared at her. He did not speak. He turned and walked away. The princess was named Elizabeth after her grandmother. Henry did not attend the christening. He could not bear to look at her. Another daughter, another failure, another sign that God was not pleased. But Anne held the child in her arms and smiled. She did not know that this girl, this disappointment, would one outshine them all. She did not know that the daughter she held would become the greatest Tudor of them all. All she knew was that the king had left her, and in the court of Henry VIII, to be left was to be doomed. Chapter 3. The Boy King and the Bloody Mary. The old king died in the bitter cold of January 1547. He was 55 years old, but he looked like a man of 70. The golden prince who had once danced through the courts of Europe had swollen into a monstrous figure, his body so vast he could no longer walk, his leg ulcer stinking so badly that his courtiers gagged when they entered his chambers. He had outlived 6 wives, beheaded 2 of them, buried countless friends and enemies. And now, in the early hours of the morning, he slipped away in his bed at Whitehall Palace, leaving behind a realm on the edge of chaos. The men who gathered around his deathbed did not weep. They were already thinking of the future. The future was a child, a boy of 9 years old with red hair like his father's and a mind as sharp as a razor. His name was Edward, and he was the son Henry had prayed for, the son who had cost Catherine of Aragon her marriage, Anne Boleyn her head, and Jane Seymour her life. Edward was the Tudor dream made flesh, and now that dream was about to become a nightmare. Edward was at Hertford Castle when the news arrived. He was studying as he always studied. His tutors had shaped him into something his father never was, a scholar, a theologian, a prince of the new faith. He spoke Latin and French fluently. He kept a journal in Greek. He wrote essays on predestination and the corruption of the papacy. He was in many ways a brilliant boy, but he was also a boy. He had never ridden into battle. He had never addressed Parliament. He had never known a moment when his life was not guarded, scheduled, and controlled. When his uncle, Edward Seymour, arrived with the news of the king's death, the boy listened in silence. Then he knelt, he prayed, and then he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the frozen garden. He was king now, King of England, King of Ireland, supreme head of the church. He was 9 years old. The coronation was held in February, a truncated ceremony because of the plague that was sweeping through London. Edward was dressed in cloth of gold and crimson velvet, the robes so heavy they made his thin shoulders sag. As the crown was placed on his head, he looked out at the assembled nobles and saw not loyalty but hunger. They were wolves circling. He knew it even then. He wrote in his journal that night, "The crown of England is heavy, but I will bear it for God's glory." The wolves wasted no time. Edward Seymour, now the Duke of Somerset, seized control of the Regency Council. He declared himself Lord Protector, the man who would rule in the boy's name. He moved the king to the royal apartments at the Tower of London, supposedly for safety, but really to isolate him from rival factions. Edward understood. He was a prisoner in all but name. A gilded prisoner, yes, a king, but a prisoner nonetheless. The religious revolution began almost immediately. Thomas Cranmer, the archbishop who had married Henry to Anne Boleyn, was still alive, still scheming, still dreaming of a Protestant England. With a boy on the throne and a protector who sympathized with the reformers, Cranmer moved fast. The Mass was abolished. The altars were torn down. The statues of saints were smashed. The walls of the churches were whitewashed, covering centuries of color and faith in a coat of lime. Edward watched it all with a scholar's interest. He read the new prayer book in Latin and English, comparing the translations, marking the passages he approved. He wrote letters to the reformers on the continent, discussing fine points of theology. He was a boy playing at being a man, a king playing at being a priest. He believed, with the fervent certainty of the young, that he was doing God's work. But God's work was expensive, and the money was running out. The economy was crumbling. Henry VIII had left the treasury empty, the coinage debased, the monasteries dissolved, and their wealth squandered on wars that achieved nothing. Somerset tried to fix it. He raised taxes. He debased the currency further. He issued proclamations that no one obeyed. And in the summer of 1549, the country exploded. It started in Cornwall, where the people still spoke their ancient language and still loved the old faith. When the new prayer book in English was imposed on them, they rose in rebellion. They marched on Exeter, thousands of them, carrying crosses and banners, demanding the return of the Latin Mass. They sang hymns as they marched. They prayed as they fought. And when the king's army met them in the fields outside the city, they died. Edward read the reports from the battlefield with a cold detachment. He wrote in his journal, "Certain rebels in the West Country have been defeated. The captains are to be hanged." He did not ask about the common people, the farmers and fishermen who had taken up arms for the faith of their fathers. He did not wonder why they would risk everything for a mass they could not understand. To him, they were simply traitors, and traitors died. But the Western Rebellion was only the beginning. In Norfolk, a tanner named Robert Kett led a different kind of rising. His followers were not fighting for the old religion. They were fighting for land, for justice, for an end to the enclosures that were stealing the common fields from the poor. They camped on Mousehold Heath, outside Norwich, and they held the city for weeks. Edward sent an army against them, led by the ruthless John Dudley, Earl of Warwick. Kett's men were slaughtered. Kett himself was hanged from the walls of Norwich Castle, his body left to rot as a warning. Edward watched it all from his palace, surrounded by tapestries and books, protected by guards who would die for him. He did not see the blood. He did not smell the burning. He was a king, and kings were supposed to be above such things. But he was also a boy, and boys feel fear. He began to fear his uncle. Somerset had failed. The rebellions, the economic collapse, the endless plots, it was all his fault. The council moved against him. In October 1549, Somerset was arrested and sent to the Tower. Edward wrote in his journal, "The Lord Protector is deposed. He has governed badly." There was no grief, no gratitude for the man who had raised him, just a cold political observation. John Dudley, now the Duke of Northumberland, took control. He was a different kind of wolf, smoother, cleverer, more dangerous. He flattered the boy king, encouraged his studies, gave him the illusion of power. And slowly, carefully, he began to shape Edward into a weapon against the greatest threat to the Protestant cause. his own sister Mary. Mary Tudor was 33 years old. She was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess Henry had cast aside. She had spent her entire life in the shadows, declared a bastard, stripped of her household, forbidden from seeing her mother. But she had never bent. She had never broken. She remained a Catholic, hearing Mass in secret, defying every law her father and brother passed. The ambassadors who visited her reported that she was stubborn, pious, and utterly convinced that God was on her side. Edward hated her, not as a sister but as a symbol. She was the past, the old faith, the darkness he was trying to drag England out of. He wrote in his journal that she was a threat to the realm, a traitor who refused to obey the laws. He considered having her executed, but she was his sister, and even Edward, for all his coldness, hesitated to shed family blood. He would not hesitate forever. By the winter of 1552, Edward was dying. The signs had been there for months: the cough that would not clear, the fever that came and went, the weakness in his limbs. His doctors diagnosed consumption, the same disease that had killed his grandfather and would one day kill millions. They bled him, purged him, fed him ground-up pearls and powdered unicorn horn. Nothing worked. He grew thinner, paler, weaker. He knew, with the terrible clarity of the dying, that he would not see another summer. The question of the succession consumed him. He had no children. He was 15 years old and he was dying. Under the law, the crown should pass to his sister Mary, but Mary was Catholic. Mary would undo everything he had built. She would drag England back to Rome, back to the Pope, back to the darkness. He could not allow it. Northumberland saw his opportunity. He whispered in the king's ear, feeding his fears, shaping his thoughts. There was another heir, he suggested, a Protestant heir, Lady Jane Grey. She was the granddaughter of Henry VII's younger sister, a brilliant, devout girl of 16, married to Northumberland's own son. If Edward would change the succession, if he would name Jane his heir, then the Reformation would be safe. England would be safe. Edward hesitated. It was illegal. It was treason against his father's will, against the act of succession, against everything he had been taught about the divine right of kings. But he was a king, and kings made the law. He called for his lawyers. He dictated a new will, a devise for the succession, excluding Mary and Elizabeth both, settling the crown on Jane and her male heirs. He signed it with a hand so weak he could barely hold the pen. In the spring of 1553, as the first flowers bloomed in the gardens of Greenwich, Edward Tudor lay in his bed, waiting for death. He could hear the birds singing outside his window. He could smell the fresh grass. He was 15 years old, and he had never loved anyone. He had never been loved. He had been a king, a scholar, a reformer, but he had never been a boy. On the 6th of July, he opened his eyes and looked at the men gathered around his bed. Northumberland was there, his face a mask of false grief. Cranmer was there, praying in Latin, the language Edward had banned. He tried to speak. He wanted to say something, a warning, a prayer, a goodbye, but no sound came. He closed his eyes, and the boy king was gone. For 3 days, the council kept his death a secret. They moved Jane Grey into the Tower, preparing her for the crown. They sent out letters, forged in Edward's name, summoning Mary to her brother's deathbed. They believed they could trap her, capture her, end the Catholic threat forever. But Mary was not fooled. She had spent her life learning to read the lies of men. When the letter arrived, she did not ride to London. She rode north. She rode to the estates of her loyal followers. She rode to fight for her crown. The battle for England had begun. Mary rode into London in August of 1553, not as a prisoner, but as a queen. The crowds that lined the streets were larger than any that had greeted her brother or her father. They cheered for her, not because they loved her, they barely knew her, but because she was the rightful heir. She was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the beloved Spanish princess. She was the hope of those who had suffered under the Protestant Revolution. But Mary did not see the cheering crowds. She saw the faces of the men who had betrayed her. She saw Northumberland kneeling before her, begging for mercy. She saw Jane Grey, the 9-day queen, huddled in her rooms in the Tower. And she saw in her mind's eye the face of her mother, Catherine, who had died alone, abandoned, her heart broken by the man Mary still called father. Mercy was not in her nature. Northumberland went to the block. Jane Grey followed him, a girl of 16, so small that she had to kneel on the straw and feel blindly for the block because she could not see through her own terror. Mary watched from a window, her face expressionless. She was queen, and queens did what was necessary. The religious persecution began slowly, then accelerated. Mary had waited her entire life to restore the Catholic faith. She had the power now, she had Parliament, she had the support of her cousin, Emperor Charles V, and she had the fires. The burnings started in February 1555. The first victims were clergymen, John Rogers, Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley. They were chained to stakes in Oxford, in the ditch outside the city walls, and the faggots were lit beneath them. Latimer spoke to Ridley as the flames rose. "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle, by God's grace, in England, as I trust shall never be put out." The smoke rose over Oxford, black and thick, carrying the smell of burning flesh across the countryside. The people watched in silence. They did not cheer, they did not protest. They watched and they remembered. Over the next 3 years, nearly 300 men and women went to the stake. They were weavers and farmers, priests and housewives. They died for refusing to give up their faith, for believing that the bread and wine were not the body and blood of Christ, for reading the Bible in English. They died singing psalms, praying, crying out to God, and with each death, the people's hatred for their queen grew. Mary did not understand. She believed she was saving souls. She believed she was doing God's work. She sat in her chapel for hours each day, kneeling on the cold stones, praying for the souls of the heretics she burned. She gave money to the poor. She founded religious houses. She tried, in her way, to be a good queen, but the fires spoke louder than her prayers. In 1554, she married Philip of Spain, her cousin's son, a man 11 years younger than herself. She loved him with a desperate, clinging love. She wrote him letters when he was away, letters full of longing, begging him to return. He did not love her. He used her for her kingdom, and when he had what he wanted, he left. She never saw him again. In 1555, she believed she was pregnant. Her belly swelled. Her breasts grew tender. She prepared the nursery, ordered the cradle, wrote to Philip with the news. But the months passed and no child came. It was not a pregnancy. It was a tumor or a phantom, or the cruel joke of a body that had betrayed her one last time. She withdrew into herself after that. The fires continued, but her heart was not in them. She was sick, tired, and alone. The husband she loved had abandoned her. The child she longed for would never come. The people she ruled hated her. And across the Channel, in France, her half-sister Elizabeth waited, watched, and survived. In November 1558, as the winter closed in around London, Mary Tudor lay in her bed at St. James's Palace, dying. She was 42 years old. She had reigned for 5 years. She had burned heretics, lost Calais, and destroyed any hope of a Catholic restoration. As the end approached, she sent for Elizabeth. She wanted to see her one last time. She wanted to ask for her forgiveness. She wanted to die in peace. Elizabeth did not come. She was at Hatfield House, waiting for the news, waiting for the crown. On the morning of November 17, the bells of London began to toll. Mary was dead. And in Hatfield, Elizabeth knelt in the garden beneath an oak tree. When the messengers arrived, riding hard with the news, she looked up at the grey sky and spoke the words of Psalm 118. "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." The last Tudor queen had begun her reign. Chapter 4: The Virgin Queen's Game. The guns of the Tower of London thundered across the river on the morning of November 17, 1558. They were not firing in salute to the dead, but in welcome to the living. Mary Tudor, the first queen regnant of England, was dead at the age of 42, her body wasted by fever, her heart broken by the husband who had abandoned her and the phantom pregnancies that had betrayed her. And riding through the gates of the Tower, pale and composed, her red hair hidden beneath a hood, was the daughter of Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth was 25 years old. She had spent much of her life as a prisoner, shuffling between royal palaces and dank fortresses, never knowing when the axe might fall. She had watched her mother go to the block when she was not yet 3. She had been declared a bastard, then restored, then bastard again. She had survived the paranoid reign of her brother Edward and the fiery wrath of her sister Mary. She had learned, in the hardest school imaginable, that to survive as a woman in a world of men, you must think faster, move quieter, and trust no one. As she dismounted in the courtyard of the Tower, the place where her mother had spent her last nights, Elizabeth knelt on the cold stones. She prayed, not for her sister's soul, there was little love lost between them, but for herself, for the strength to do what must be done. When she rose, her knees were wet and her face was calm. She looked up at the windows of the royal apartments, the same windows her mother had looked through on the morning of her execution, and she walked inside. The first weeks of her reign were a masterclass in political theatre. She assembled her council, a mix of seasoned survivors and hungry newcomers. She listened more than she spoke. She watched the men who watched her, measuring their ambitions, their fears, their weaknesses. William Cecil, a sober, cautious man who had served her in secret during her sister's reign, became her principal secretary. She trusted him more than any other. "This judgment I have of you," she told him, "that you will not be corrupted by any manner of gift, and that you will be faithful to the state." But faithfulness to the state meant navigating a maze of deadly pressures. England was bankrupt, its treasury drained by Mary's disastrous war with France. The religious settlement was a ticking bomb. Catholics who had burned Protestants under Mary now feared the reverse. The continent was watching, waiting to see if this young woman, this female ruler in a world of kings, would stumble and fall. Elizabeth's first parliament begged her to marry. It was the same plea every queen regnant heard, the same demand. "Give us a king, give us an heir, give us stability." They presented their petitions with solemn faces, warning of the chaos that would follow if she died childless. Elizabeth listened. She thanked them, and then she did nothing. She understood something they did not. Marriage was not a solution, it was a trap. If she married an Englishman, she would elevate one noble family above all others, sparking jealousy and civil war. If she married a foreign prince, she would become a pawn in his ambitions, dragging England into continental wars. And if she married and bore a child, she would become irrelevant, a queen consort, a mother, a shadow. She looked at the men who begged her to wed and saw, beneath their concern, their hunger. They wanted to control her. They wanted to own her. They wanted to be the man who tamed the Tudor witch. She would not be tamed. The game of marriage began almost immediately. Philip of Spain, her sister's widower, offered himself. He was the most powerful monarch in Europe, the master of the New World silver, the defender of the Catholic faith. An alliance with him would protect England from France and bring wealth beyond imagining. But Elizabeth remembered what her sister's marriage to Philip had brought: loneliness, humiliation, and the loss of Calais, England's last foothold in France. She smiled at his ambassador, spoke sweet words of friendship, and let the negotiations drag into nothing. Then came the Archduke Charles of Austria, the younger son of the Holy Roman Emperor. Then Eric of Sweden, who sent ambassadors with poetry and promises. Then a dozen minor princes, each with his own agenda, his own demands, his own dreams of a crown. Elizabeth entertained them all. She flirted with them, she dazzled them, and she dismissed them. Her council grew frustrated. They could not understand her. They saw a woman past her prime. 25 was old for a bride in those days, playing games with the future of the realm. They did not see what Elizabeth saw, that her unmarried state was her greatest weapon. As long as she remained unwed, every prince in Europe would seek her favor. As long as she remained unwed, she could play France against Spain, Catholics against Protestants, keeping England safe through the simple fact of her desirability. But there was one man she desired, one man who made her forget the game. Robert Dudley was her childhood friend, her fellow prisoner in the Tower during the dark days of Mary's reign. He was handsome, charming, and utterly devoted to her. She made him master of the horse, a position that kept him constantly at her side. They rode together, danced together, laughed together in a way she laughed with no one else. The court whispered. The ambassadors wrote home with scandalous rumors. When Elizabeth fell ill with smallpox in 1562 and named Dudley protector of the realm in the event of her death, the whispers became screams. There was one problem: Dudley was married. His wife, Amy Robsart, lived in the countryside, away from court, away from the Queen. She was sickly, they said. She was unhappy. And in September 1560, she was found dead at the bottom of a staircase at Cumnor Place, her neck broken. The scandal exploded. Everyone suspected Dudley had arranged her death to free himself for the Queen. Elizabeth knew she could not marry him now. To do so would confirm the rumors, would stain her reign with blood. She sent Dudley away from court, weeping in private, maintaining her public composure. She would never love again, or if she did, she would never show it. She looked in the mirror that night, studying her face in the candlelight. The smallpox had left scars, hidden now by powder and paint. She was no longer young. She was no longer beautiful in the way the poets described, but she was queen, and queens did not need love, they needed power. She made her decision. She would be married, but not to a man, she would be married to England. The cult of the Virgin Queen was born in the ashes of her disappointment. Elizabeth cultivated it carefully, feeding the poets and painters who compared her to Diana, to Astrea, to the Moon King who needed no man. She appeared before her people in cloth of silver and white satin, her red wig glittering with pearls, her pale face a mask of eternal youth. She called herself their mother, their mistress, their queen, and they worshipped her. But the game grew harder as the years passed. Across the sea, in France, in Spain, in the palaces of the Vatican, a darker cult was growing, the cult of Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary Stuart was Elizabeth's cousin, the granddaughter of Henry VII's sister Margaret. She was also the Queen of Scotland, the widow of the French king, and the great hope of English Catholics. To them, Elizabeth was a bastard, a heretic, a usurper. Mary was the true queen, anointed by God and Rome, and Mary was beautiful. In 1568, Mary made a fatal mistake. She fled Scotland after her subjects rose against her, crossing the Solway Firth into England in a fishing boat, expecting sanctuary from her cousin. Elizabeth received her with courtesy and locked her in a castle. For 19 years, Mary remained a prisoner, moving from one noble household to the next, always guarded, always watched. But her captivity did not silence her. She wrote letters, hundreds of them, to her allies in France, to the Pope, to anyone who would listen. She plotted. She schemed. She became the focus of every Catholic conspiracy against Elizabeth. The Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot, the Babington plot, each one aimed to kill Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne. Each one was uncovered by Cecil's network of spies, and each one brought the executioner's axe closer to Mary's neck. Elizabeth resisted. She could not bear to kill an anointed queen, her own cousin, a fellow woman in a world of men. She delayed, she hesitated, she sent warnings. She hoped Mary would simply disappear, would renounce her claims, would fade into the history books. But Mary would not bend. She believed, with the fervent faith of a martyr, that God would save her. In August 1586, Cecil's spies intercepted a packet of letters hidden in a beer barrel. They were from Mary to Anthony Babington, a young Catholic gentleman who had sworn to kill the Queen. Mary's letters were explicit. She approved the plot. She gave her blessing to the assassination. She signed her own death warrant. Elizabeth wept when she read them. She wept for her cousin. She wept for herself. She wept for the cruelty of a world that forced queens to kill queens. But she signed the warrant. And on the morning of February 8, 1587, in the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle, Mary, Queen of Scots, knelt before the block. She was dressed in black satin, with a crucifix at her throat. She prayed in Latin as the executioners approached. When the axe fell, it took 2 strokes to sever her head. The executioner held it up, and the red wig came away in his hand, revealing grey hair, cropped short. The woman who had been the most beautiful princess in Europe was gone. In London, when the news arrived, Elizabeth raged. She claimed she had never meant the warrant to be sent. She blamed Cecil. She blamed everyone but herself. She wore black for months. She had nightmares, but Mary was dead, and the Catholic threat, for all its fury, had lost its heart. Elizabeth had survived again. In the summer of 1588, the greatest test of her reign arrived. The Spanish Armada, 130 ships carrying 30,000 men, sailed from Lisbon, bound for England. Philip II had waited 30 years for this moment. He would avenge Mary, restore the Catholic faith, and crush the heretic queen who had defied him for so long. Elizabeth went to Tilbury, where her army was encamped, waiting for the invasion. She rode among them on a grey gelding, wearing a white velvet dress and a silver breastplate, a general's truncheon in her hand. She was 60 years old. She had never led an army in battle, but she spoke to them as if she had. "I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman," she called out, her voice carrying across the field. "But I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm." The men cheered. They cheered until they were hoarse. They would die for this woman. They would die for England. But the battle was not fought on land. It was fought at sea, in the Channel, where the English ships harried the Spanish fleet, driving them north into the storms. The Armada was scattered, wrecked on the coasts of Ireland and Scotland. Less than half the ships returned to Spain. When the news reached London, Elizabeth walked in procession to St. Paul's Cathedral to give thanks to God. The streets were lined with cheering crowds. She was not just a queen now, she was a legend. She was Gloriana. She was the woman who had defeated the greatest power on earth. But legends do not age well. In the years that followed, the glory faded. The war with Spain dragged on, bleeding the treasury dry. The harvests failed and the poor starved. The courtiers grew greedy, corrupt, scheming. And Elizabeth grew old. She looked in her mirror one morning and saw what she had become. The face was a ruin, buried under paint. The teeth were black and rotten. The hands were gnarled with age. She threw the mirror down and smashed it. She would never look again. She clung to power as the century turned. She refused to name an heir. She refused to discuss the future. She refused to admit that the Tudor line was ending. She was the last of them, the last child of Henry VIII, the last hope of a dynasty that had begun in blood and betrayal, and she would not let go. Chapter 5: The Sunset King. The woman who stood at the window of Richmond Palace on a winter morning in 1602 was a ghost. She was draped in white, as always, white silk, white pearls, white ruff framing a face that had once been the most celebrated in Christendom. But the face now was a mask, thickly painted with ceruse and vinegar to hide the scars of time, the pockmarks from the smallpox that had nearly killed her 40 years before. The red wig was still elaborate, still jeweled, but it sat upon a head that had grown small and bird-like with age. Elizabeth Tudor was 69 years old. She had reigned for 44 years, longer than any English monarch since the Norman conquest. She had outlived her enemies, outlived her friends, outlived her lovers. Robert Dudley was 20 years in his grave. William Cecil, her faithful spirit, had died in 1598, and she had nursed him herself in his final illness, spooning broth into his mouth with her own trembling hands. His son, Robert Cecil, now served her, a hunchbacked, cunning little man who treated her with the careful deference one shows to a dangerous relic. She could not sleep. The nights were the worst. She would lie in her great bed, surrounded by velvet curtains, listening to the crackle of the fire and the distant footsteps of her ladies in the adjoining chamber. Her mind would drift backward to places she had tried to forget. She saw her mother, Anne Boleyn, as she must have looked on the scaffold, young still, dark-eyed, terrified. She saw her sister Mary, dying alone at St. James's Palace, abandoned by everyone. She saw Mary, Queen of Scots, kneeling before the block, the axe rising, falling, rising again. And she saw the faces of the men who had wanted to marry her. The Archduke, the King of Sweden, the Duke of Anjou, her frog, the French prince young enough to be her son, whom she had called her little frog and danced with in the gardens, knowing she would never marry him, knowing she was leading him on, knowing it was cruel but necessary. She had used them all, and now they were gone and she was alone. In the mornings her ladies would help her dress. It took hours. The corsets, the farthingales, the sleeves that had to be pinned just so, the jewels that had to be arranged. She would stand before the mirror, studying the stranger who looked back at her. The eyes were still sharp, grey, piercing, the eyes of her father, but everything else had faded. She was a painting left too long in the sun. The courtiers noticed. They whispered behind their hands. The Queen was failing. The Queen forgot names. The Queen stared into space for hours at a time. They said it with grief, some of them. They said it with hunger, most of them, because everyone knew what came next. The Queen would die, and when she died, the Tudor line would die with her. The question of the succession had haunted her entire reign. She had refused to name an heir, knowing that to name one was to create a rival, a focus for rebellion, a living threat to her throne. She had kept them all guessing: the King of Scotland, James VI, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, the Infanta of Spain, the various English claimants with their various English schemes. She had played them against each other, kept them waiting, kept them hopping. But now she was dying, and the waiting was almost over. The last years of Elizabeth's reign were years of shadow. The golden age, if it had ever existed, was long past. The economy was strained by years of war with Spain. The harvests failed, and the price of bread soared. In the streets of London, men muttered against the Queen's favourites, against the corruption of the court, against the old woman who had ruled too long. The favourite was Robert de Vereux, the Earl of Essex. He was young, handsome, reckless, everything Elizabeth had once loved in a man. She had favoured him as she had favoured Dudley decades before. She had given him commands, promotions, the kind of access that made other noblemen burn with envy, and he had repaid her with contempt. Essex believed the Queen was old, senile, irrelevant. He believed he should rule in her place. In 1599, she sent him to Ireland to crush a rebellion. He failed. He made a truce with the rebels against her express orders. He abandoned his post and rode back to England, bursting into her bedchamber unannounced while she was still in her night clothes, her grey hair loose about her shoulders, her face unmasked. She received him calmly. She listened to his excuses, and then she had him arrested. For a year she hesitated. She could not bear to destroy the last man she had loved. She reduced his sentence, released him, placed him under house arrest. But Essex was beyond saving. In February 1601, he marched into London at the head of a small army, hoping to raise the city against his enemies. The city did not rise. The rebellion collapsed. And this time, Elizabeth did not hesitate. She signed his death warrant with a hand that did not shake. She watched from a window as they led him to the block, there in the Tower courtyard where her mother had died. She did not weep. She had forgotten how. After Essex died, something in her broke. The light that had sustained her, the fierce will that had kept her alive through 50 years of danger, began to gutter. She stopped receiving ambassadors. She stopped attending council meetings. She sat in her chambers, staring at nothing, speaking to no one. Robert Cecil, the hunchback who now ran the government, watched her decline with a mixture of pity and calculation. He had already opened secret negotiations with James of Scotland, preparing for the transfer of power. He knew the Queen would not last another winter. He knew the Tudor line was ending, and he knew that when it ended, he would be the man who kept England steady. In the autumn of 1602, Elizabeth roused herself for one last appearance. She rode through London to open Parliament, propped in her carriage, her face a painted mask of defiance. The crowds cheered, but the cheers were thin. They were cheering not for the woman they saw, but for the memory of the woman she had been. They were cheering for the Armada, for the defeat of Spain, for the glory days. They were cheering for a ghost. She felt it, she knew. When she returned to Richmond that night, she did not speak. She walked slowly to her chambers, leaning on the arm of her lady-in-waiting. She looked back once, at the corridor behind her, at the guards who bowed as she passed, and then she closed the door. The end came in March of 1603. Elizabeth took to her bed and did not rise again. She lay among the velvet cushions, her breath shallow, her eyes sometimes open, sometimes closed. Her ladies brought her broth, which she refused. They brought her wine, which she pushed away. They brought her priests, who prayed in Latin, in English, in the languages of the old faith and the new. She listened to them all and spoke to none. Robert Cecil came to her bedside. He knelt beside her, his twisted body aching with the effort. He told her that all was well, that the realm was peaceful, that she need not worry. She looked at him, and for a moment her eyes cleared. She knew what he was doing. She knew he was already serving the next king. She did not blame him. It was what she would have done. "Who?" she whispered. It was the only word she had spoken in days. Cecil leaned closer. "James, the King of Scots." She closed her eyes. James, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, the son of the woman she had killed. It was fitting, in a way. The blood would return to blood. The Tudors had begun with a usurper from Wales, and they would end with a king from Scotland. The wheel had turned. On the night of March 23, the Archbishop of Canterbury came to her room. He stayed with her for hours, praying, speaking the old words of comfort. She did not respond. He later said that she lay motionless, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes fixed on some distant point that only she could see. What did she see in those final hours? Did she see her mother, young and laughing, before the fall? Did she see her father, golden and terrible, lifting her high in his arms? Did she see Dudley, riding beside her in the tilt yard, his smile a promise that could never be kept? Did she see the faces of the men she had sent to their deaths, the women who had knelt before the block, the children who had never been born? Or did she see nothing? Did she simply let go, at last, of the weight she had carried for 45 years, the weight of the crown, the weight of the dynasty, the weight of being the last Tudor standing? In the early morning of March 24, 1603, Elizabeth Tudor died. She died as she had lived, alone, surrounded by people, but utterly alone. Her ladies found her in the morning, her body still, her face peaceful. The mask of paint had been washed away, and beneath it was just a woman, old and tired, finally at rest. The news spread through London like fire. The Queen was dead. The Queen was dead. The crowds gathered in the streets, uncertain whether to weep or cheer. They had known no other ruler. She had been their mother, their mistress, their Gloriana, and now she was gone. A few hours later, a messenger rode north toward Edinburgh. He carried a ring, the ring Elizabeth had promised to send when she was gone. He carried the news that James Stuart, King of Scots, was now King of England. The Tudor line was extinct. The Stuart line had begun. They buried her in Westminster Abbey, in the same vault as her sister Mary. The two queens, who had hated each other in life, lay together in death. The inscription on their tomb reads simply, "Partners both in throne and grave, here rest we two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in hope of one resurrection." But Elizabeth's body did not rest easily. They had embalmed her, filled her with spices and preservatives, but the work was poorly done. The coffin leaked. The smell, they said, was terrible. They buried her quickly, without the pomp she deserved. It was as if the nation wanted to forget her, to move on, to embrace the new king and the new age. But they could not forget her. She was too deeply woven into the fabric of England. She had given them victory over Spain, prosperity, a sense of themselves as a people chosen by God. She had given them the Church of England, the prayer book, the Bible in English. She had given them a golden age of poetry and music and exploration, and she had given them herself, her image, her myth, her legend. The poets who had celebrated her in life continued to celebrate her in death. They called her Astrea, the King of Justice. They called her Belphobe, the Virgin Knight. They called her Gloriana, the Fairy Queen. They transformed her into something she had never been: perfect, pure, eternal. And in doing so, they preserved her. But the real Elizabeth, the woman who had laughed and wept and raged and loved, the woman who had held a kingdom together with nothing but her wits and her will, that woman was gone. And with her went the Tudors. Think of what they had been: a Welsh adventurer landing on a beach with a few thousand men, claiming a crown that was not his. A golden prince, destroying the faith of his fathers for the love of a dark-eyed woman. A boy king, dying before he could become a man. A broken queen, burning her subjects in the name of a love that had never loved her back. And finally, the last of them, a woman who had refused to be mastered by any man, who had ruled alone in an age that demanded she marry, who had outlasted them all. The Tudors were not a dynasty of saints. They were a dynasty of survivors. They were forged in blood, and blood sustained them. They betrayed their friends, executed their relatives, broke the hearts of those who loved them. They were cruel, capricious, and often mad, but they were never boring. They were never small. They were never forgettable. And when the last of them lay in her leaking coffin, waiting for the grave, England was not the same place it had been when the first of them rode onto Bosworth Field. It was richer, stronger, prouder. It was Protestant. It was independent. It was, in a way that had never been true before, a nation. The Stuarts would come, the Civil War would come, the Commonwealth would come, but the Tudors would remain, etched into the memory of the island like the scars on a warrior's face. They were the family that built modern England, and they built it with their blood, their betrayal, and their bones. In the long silence of Westminster Abbey, the two sisters lie together. The candles gutter and go out. The footsteps of tourists echo and fade. And the dynasty that began in the mud of a Leicestershire field returns, at last, to the dust from which it came.